You may have noticed in the last shot, as we separated the transmission and transfer case, that the rear bearing actually pulled off of the main shaft and stayed with the transfer case, which was why we were having a little bit of trouble getting it off there. This bearing is actually a press fit bearing, and normally you're going to have to press or knock it off of that shaft. The bearing retainer and the oil collector are going to be held in by one of two types of bolts. Either this Allen head bolt style or this 12.5/16. A lot of people will see that 12 point and get worried about it. But as long as you got a 12.5/16 socket, you're covered. Now it's time to remove the bolts for the front bearing retainer. Remove the bearing retainer, and you'll notice that the front seal is there. Most of these will have a rubber seal on the front. This one is solid felt. With the bearing retainer removed, we can now access the bolts for the oil collector. I'm going to leave the top one partially in so that you can see how it drops out of the way when we remove that final bolt. Note how the oil collector falls down into the case when you remove the final bolt. With the oil collector now out of the way, we can now slide the main gear and front bearing forward about 3/8 of an inch. This is going to give us clearance for removing the main shaft. Now we're ready to remove the main shaft from the transmission. That's where we take the wire back off. Fish it back out of there. You can either hang on to it for later or make a new one when you go to put it back together. Now, remember that your main gear is slid all the way forward. You've now removed your wire, so now this is how it's free to rotate and move around in there. What you want to do is try to slide the clutch sleeve forward to about there. And a lot of times, and this will happen, your bearing retainer will snag inside the case right here. If your bearing retainer is stuck in the case, just tap it out. There you go. With the bearing retainer removed, this entire assembly will lift up and out of there and back. Slide your bearing retainer out, and the entire assembly will move aft and out of the transmission. Okay, at this time, now that we have the main shaft out, we're going to drive out the cluster gear counter shaft. You'll notice on the back side, as that's going in, the counter shaft is coming out. With the counter shaft removed, you can now tap the wooden dowel into the case the rest of the way, and the cluster gear should fall to the bottom of the case. Now that the main shaft has been removed, the cluster gear has been dropped to the bottom, and the oil collector has been pushed as far out of the way as possible, we're going to remove the main gear. Once the main gear is removed, we can remove the oil collector. With the main gear and oil collector out of the way, the cluster gear has been dropped to the bottom of the box. We can just reach in. There's a little bit of wiggling and maneuvering. It should come out, but it will have to come out through the top. Normally what's going to happen when you remove this is these washers are going to fall off, the rod's going to slide out, and all those needle bearings are going to fall into the bottom. But because we've got all this heavy grease in here, all of it's staying in place. We're going to push it apart in just a second. This is what's normally going to happen when you go to lift this out of the case. It's going to slowly and sometimes quickly start to slide out. All those little needle bearings are going to have to be packed back into the cluster gear. At this point, the only thing left inside the case is going to be the reverse idler gear and its countershaft. And we've got to take this locking plate off to do the next step. Okay? A lot of people have had trouble getting this shaft out. So far, using this technique, I've not had any. I find a socket that will fit over the end of that shaft. I find 3 more of the same length, deep well sockets, and then I stand the transmission up on these 3 sockets in a tripod pattern. If you are more comfortable using 4, you can use 4. Reverse idler gear, reverse idler shaft removed. Now it's time to take the main shaft assembly apart. We're going to start off by sliding the clutch sleeve off the front. Watch the synchronizer springs because they have a tendency, they can pop out, although they usually don't. I'm not going to tell you they won't because they have. Blocking ring, front blocking ring, the clutch sleeve, synchronizer spring, synchronizer plate. There should be 3 of them. 2, and here is the 3rd one. The rest of this assembly you can't take off unless you take this snap ring off on the front right here. And I am not the master of snap rings. So you may see this video cut in and out as I remove this snap ring. I might get lucky and it might pop right off for me. Now, off comes the clutch hub, holding in, of course, the final synchronizer spring. The second gear synchronizer blocking ring, and the second gear assembly. Also leaves us the first reverse gear. Now, a lot of people, their simple method of taking this aft bearing off, remember I told you earlier it'd come off, and I put it back on just to show you how a lot of people will take it off. They'll just take the reverse slide gear and tap it off like that. First reverse gear, bearing retainer, aft bearing spacer. The main gear bearing, front main gear bearing, has to be slid off of the main gear, and that should be pressed off. That's what we're going to do. But before it comes off, this snap ring is going to have to come off. As I've told you previously, snap rings are my nemesis, so we'll see how this one comes off. Hey! How about that? Alright, now we're going to go back and press this off. In my original rebuild guide, I listed a couple of backyard methods for removing this bearing. As the years have gone on, I've come to the conclusion that you really can't beat a shop press or an arbor press for removing this front bearing. However, if you don't have one, those techniques are still going to be in the book, but for those who have access to one or can purchase one and resell it when they're done, I recommend using an arbor press or a shop press. You just can't beat that for ease of use.